Hey, welcome to the video. Welcome to the channel. Today I'm preparing some cedar lumber to build a sign. We got a little sign project I'm working on. So I've got some 1x cedar and some 4x4 cedar poles. The 4x4 poles that we're going to be working with today I milled up recently and have a video out on those. The 1x's I milled up some time back and I do not have a video on those. This video isn't necessarily a how-to video, it's more of a how I do it video. When I start planing lumber, I get a tape measure of course and measure the thickness of my lumber and see how consistent my boards are. But after the lumber dries from a sawmill, it develops warps and bows and twists and little inconsistencies in the surface of the lumber itself. So it's no longer flat. Think of it like a dry leaf. It all kind of shrivels up a little bit, particularly around knots and things like that. So that being said, I usually measure the lumber and then open the throat of the planer just a little farther open than the measurement of the lumber, so that you don't end up with a piece that's cutting the maximum thickness that the planer will go and then bind up in the planer. That's why you see me passing boards through it to start with. It didn't really look like I was doing anything to them. Once you get the boards run through it where you know that all of them will fit through it, then you can start adjusting it down pretty quickly. Ordinarily, without video, and I usually pick however many boards I think I'm going to use for a project, and I run all of those through it one pass the first time. In this video I didn't do it that way because I wasn't sure how much planing I was going to show in the video ultimately at the end. So I just did a few boards at a time. So you see me doing like 3 batches of boards. That's not typically the way I do the lumber. So this lumber was pretty consistent at being about 1 inch thick in the rough. So I started the planer open about 1 1/16 to allow for those high spots that I was speaking of. So I wouldn't have minded if I'd had some 2-inch material to build this out of. So what I'm trying to achieve out of these 1x's is just as thick a lumber as I can clean up. So I'm not like trying to end up at 3/4 of an inch or something. So generally speaking, when I'm planing lumber, I prefer to run it through, tighten the thickness of the planer just a little, run it back through on the opposite side, and every time I run it through for the first few times, flip the boards over. That way you're actually planing off any high spots. If you've got a high spot around a knot and it's on the bottom, then you're going to surface the whole surrounding board to the thickness because of that knot that's actually got the board lifted up off of the bed. So you can end up with some pretty thin material accidentally. I like to kind of eyeball them before I put them in the planer for those humps, I'm going to call it. Put those humps up. I also like to feed the stump end of the tree, the board in first. This helps with tear out around knots. So now I'm going to joint these cedar boards. They've been planed on both sides. They both edges are rough sawn off of the sawmill. they are not straight. They're just right off of the sawmill. So I'm going to run them over the joiner. The joiner is going to, properly used, is going to straighten one edge of the boards. The jointer works by a machined flat in-feed bed that holds the board as close to level as it can. Also has a back fence, which the way I've got it set is exactly 90 degrees to the bed. So as you in-feed the lumber, the knives, which I've got the disconnect off over there, the knives come up and are above the in-feed table, but the top of dead center of the knife is exactly the same height as the outfeed table. That is critical that it's set that way. That's something that you have to set, but it has to be that way because the outfeed table catches the straight piece of lumber as it comes off of the knife blade. So you don't want it to come off of the knife blade and then do some kind of teetering as it comes back here. You want it to remain dead flat in the same plane as it fed in on. So used correctly, you can use the jointer if you have a board that is twisted. If it's twisted, it'll cut that twist off of, like, say the front left is twisted down. You can peel that off, and you know, if it were actually twisted, then the back right would be down, and you'd trim that off. And of course, once you get one face true, then you can take it to the planer and put that face on the bed of the planer, and the planer knives are on top, and it will true the top edge and make it parallel to the bottom edge. You can also adjust the rear fence. Well, let me back up a second. The depth of cut is adjustable with a hand wheel. I usually keep it somewhere between a 1/16 and an 1/8 of an inch, depending on what I'm trying to cut. But the fence is adjustable in how much bed is exposed and the tilt angle of the fence. So you can take like a square block of wood, tip the fence at an angle, run it through and knock the corners off to the point where you can not have a round but have a stop sign shape if you want. It's out of square almost an eighth of an inch. So that's what I'm going to do with the joiner before I plane it, is I'm going to square it. So right now, I'm not sure if you can, it's sitting flat on the bed at the bottom right now. Across here. It's tight here and there's gap here. So what I'm going to do to square this is I'm going to hold it to the back fence to where there's gap here and it's tight to the bed here. Then as it passes over the knife here, it'll remove more material on this side than it does on this side. I've got the joiner set to about a 1/16 of an inch, so this may take 2 passes. Okay, so now I flipped the 4x4 upside down. You can, not sure if it's picking up in the camera, but here it's nearly taken the full width. Here it's still unplaned material, this wide. So through this first 3 feet, we've planed deep on this side, planing out to nothing by the time you get 2/3 of the way across. And then here, it's about center for 2 feet or so. And then it's most of the way through here. And right here, it's all but about 1 inch. So I'll set the camera down. We'll run it through one more time and that should clean it up square. And I actually need to get me a pencil because what we're doing is squaring this face to this face. That's going to be important to keep track of as we run it through the planer, because we're only producing one 90-degree corner at the moment. Okay, so now we've planed all the way from one end to the other. We've planed the entire surface. that's got it where we are square from this surface to the back surface. Let me roll one more time here. From what's now the front surface and top surface. This is a machinist square. As you can see, there is, even though that's still rough sawn, there is no daylight there. Well, hopefully this is showing up in the video. In the little screen I can't really tell, but I marked this side A and this side B, and what we just done was squared A to B. Now that doesn't mean that A to D, which I've got labeled back here, are square to each other. It just so happens that they appear to be fairly square to each other, but B to C is definitely not square to each other. So what we need to do before we take it to the planer, we're working on the jointer right now, we need to plane it next after we get the sides squared to each other. So the next thing I'm going to do is square A to D, and then when we run it through the planer, if we have A down, then C is going to get planed and squared to A. It'll be parallel with A and square to B and D, if that makes any sense. I'm going to keep it the way it was and put A against the fence and D the cutter bed. Of course, I'm going to hold A against the fence while passing it over the cutter head, and it's going to do the same thing that we done on the last surface, which is cut more material toward us, so the angle that's produced on the bed to fence of wood is greater than 90 degrees at the moment. So that's, we're trying to cut it down to where it is at 90 degrees. Okay, so on that pass, of course, D has been erased. This was D. We removed material off of the entire surface. So here's A, here's D. We're square A to D. We're not square D to C or B to C. So A to B is what we've already done, and it's square. A to D is square. So the only thing that's out is the plane or surface of C is out of square. Now B and C both have not been machined yet. They're both still rough off of the sawmill, but B and A are square to each other. B is parallel to D. So now we're going to take this one to the planer, and we're going to plane B and C, and it'll be planed on all four sides, and all four corners are going to be 90 degrees. Now I've got those 4x4s back over at the planer. I'm planing what we had called the C and D side of them. I'm taking about a 1/16 off in a pass here, so I'm able to clean them up pretty quickly, and I've got the video running at a higher speed here. But a couple passes through the planer and we're getting them cleaned right up. All of the sides will be parallel to each other, and all the corners 90 degrees I'm showing here with a square, and they're all four sides the same dimensions. Okay, so I'm not sure if I had the camera running on record or not. I've got my boards selected. They're planed on both surfaces, all the same thickness, and I've got one straight edge by running them over the joiner. So the next step is I'm gonna cut them to width. So that's what I'm working on at the moment. So what I'm trying to do is get the most I can out of these boards, but I'm trying to cut all of the sapwood, the blonde wood, off of these. It's not actually important that they're all the same width or anything like that. I'm just making this up as I go. I didn't do a really good job of explaining this while I was doing the work. These boards have just came from the joiner. You watched me join them. They have actually been roughly cut to lengths, just so I wouldn't have to rip 8-foot boards to just turn around and cross cut them yet again. So they're approximately the length I need for this project we're working on, just kind of roughed out. And so we've got the one true edge from the joiner, and I'm putting it against the fence, and then ripping the other side needs straight line, meaning parallel to the fence side, whether it has sapwood on it that needs to come off or not. We've only finished 3 out of 4 of the sides of the lumber, and this is finishing the 4th side. So once you do that, you could go back to the joiner, but you can't go to the joiner with the 4th side before you ran it through a table saw to straight line it, so that you end up with 2 parallel sides. If you just ran the other side through the joiner, you could have 2 nice smooth sides, but they may not be parallel to each other. In fact, they probably would not be parallel to each other. Anyway, so that about wraps up this video. The next one will start on the actual construction.